Yo, public service announcement before this video actually starts. I am getting really close to 100,000 subscribers. So if you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet and think you might, maybe you've caught some of my other videos and you enjoyed them, maybe give a little subscriber. Maybe like it's 100K. It's a big deal. I'd really like that. Thank you very much. Enjoy the video. So it snowed again. It's April, but I'm looking at just an endless sea of white. And I'm sure it's reflecting right back on my skin, so you're seeing an endless sea of white. And yet again, you might be wondering, are you wearing a Christmas sweater? And yes, I am, because if the seasons don't know what time of year it is, I don't need to know what time of year it is either. But speaking of the wrong time of year, we're going to talk about the New Year's horror epidemic in April. So I think we're all mostly used to January being the dump month when it comes to movies. Now you might have noticed over the years that it's pretty rare for something really good to come out in January or February unless it's some kind of indie film, or it was something that was released somewhere else limited and then went wide, kind of like how 1917 did in a lot of places this year. And while January usually holds the worst of it, this will extend into February, so those are the 2 months I've looked at when taking this into account. You also occasionally see this same phenomenon in the months of August or September after studios have gone through their big blockbuster phase. When it comes to January, you're usually dealing with the leftovers of the big Hollywood releases. This year it would have been Star Wars, and Universal was hoping it would have been Cats. But then they start dumping these disasters. And again, this usually happens because they've blown their loads on all of their big budget blockbuster releases, or they're worrying about their Oscar contenders. And like I mentioned, every once in a while you get a real gem in these, like Silence of the Lambs was one of these movies, and a lot of these will end up getting Oscar buzz, and some of them will even get Oscar wins. But it's usually pretty bad. But horror movies have always had a prominent feature in these dump months, and I feel like it's only gotten worse in the winter months as the years have gone by and they realize that people are down to clown. Now you might be wondering, Amanda, if it's already a dump month, why are we even talking about it? Well, 2020 had an unusually high number of horror movies during January and February, and a lot of them were spectacularly not great. And you might want to doubt me, but I went back and I did the math. There were at least 12 horror movies, not thrillers, something that specifically had horror attached to the genre, that were released in January and February of 2020. And I went back the past decade, and the only year that appears to come even close to this was 2017, with 8. So 2020 having 12 coming out in 2 months is quite a bit. That's more than one a week. So it was shaping up to be the year of horror, or at least the new year of horror, which is being completely overshadowed by the literal horror timeline we're all currently living in. Now, obviously, horror movies are always a draw, especially closer to Halloween, but to have so many dumped in the same 2 months that are typically reserved for the stinkers and the low-budget movies, so they don't have as much competition, is just a little bit worrisome. But before we get into the less than stellar options and kind of look at the things that we have been onslaughted with this year, I'm going to mention some of the ones that I actually enjoyed to varying degrees. So first up, we got Invisible Man. And despite the trailer just showing way too much, I had a great time watching this. It's 100% something that I'm down to watch again. I'm even willing to spend like the $20 tag just to watch it at home and give it a little bit more support. Elizabeth Moss rarely ever disappoints with her performances, and that carries over into this as well. And the intro to this movie had me completely gripped. Just the stress of escaping a home like that is probably a reality that so many people resonate with, and it kind of breaks my heart that that happens. But you know, this is a horror movie, and they handle it really well. It's very tense, it's very nerve-wracking, and that I feel like that does set a good tone for the rest of the movie. What continues on is a movie where you're wondering if she's insane, if it's all happening, if it is, how, and just ultimately resolves pretty well, which you can't always say for horror movies. I've been making jokes that this is like the setup for the MCU Fantastic Four for months, and no one's gonna stop me. I thought the acting was great. I thought they really handled like the idea of an invisible man being around really, really well, and the whole idea of like what you can see versus what you can't, where the camera chooses to focus when you literally can't see anything, but your mind tells you that something is there. Super well handled. Next up is one that I was really happy to have caught at last year's Sundance, because it did only end up getting limited release in February, and that is The Lodge. And considering how much of a stinker the turning ended up being, which we will talk about, The Lodge has a lot of really great elements that kind of deal with that same idea of like a woman in a house with 2 younger children and a bunch of insanity that falls out from that. There's some dollhouse imagery in this that kind of makes it feel a little bit like Hereditary light, but But the central premise is that these two kids have a dad who gets remarried and they really don't like the stepmom at all. They feel like she's too young for him, different things like that. But he ends up coming up with the idea that, the four of them are going to go hang out at the lodge that he owns over the holiday season. He has some last minute work to finish up, so he's like, how about you take them up early and you can kind of just get some one-on-one time with them. And as this is happening, the three of them end up getting snowed into this lodge and the dad is unable to get to them through the weather. The following days of isolation starts leading to a series of horrific events as the three try to weather out the storm. Now, some people didn't like this nearly as much as I did, but I felt gripped the entire time. This was one of the ones I saw at midnight at Sundance, so I always said if it was something that could keep me alert after watching 5 other movies in a day starting at 8:30 in the morning, I was gonna count it good, and it did. It kept me captivated the entire time. And I think they really nailed the ending, which, as I mentioned, is really hard in a lot of horror movies. I feel like studio involvement gets in the way in so many different things, and they're not willing to take the more impactful ending just for the sake of trying to clean things up a little bit for viewers. Riley Keough is fantastic as always. She completely sells this performance, and the kid actors Jaden Martell of It and Knives Out and Leah McHugh, who's been cast in Marvel's The Eternals, were great as well. Not sure if this is available for rent yet, but it's definitely something to keep on your radar. I genuinely enjoyed it and 100% want to watch it again. Now we're getting into the ones that might be a little bit more selective depending on what your tastes are, but still worth mentioning. So another limited run that I was lucky enough to see because of the fine folk over at Fangoria is VFW. This is a movie that doesn't really feel like it's channeling the 80s. It feels like it was made in the 80s, and I mean that in the best way. Great synth score, super long opening credit that kind of reminded me of The Warriors, solid grindhouse flick. It features a great cast of old school badasses, and if you're into the whole aesthetic and brutal fight for your lifestyle film, it'll probably deliver. So VFW stands for Veteran of Foreign Wars, which is anyone who served in the US military on foreign soil or hostile waters. And this takes place at a bar for these veterans before ultimately crumbling into a fight for survival when a girl with a stolen bag of drugs runs in and a gang of drug dealer punks come looking for her. The vets end up arming themselves to the teeth with anything they have and take a stand against the unrelenting attack. This is a solid midnight movie if there ever was one. If you're into that kind of 80s grindhouse horror flick, this is definitely the movie for you. Again, with something more stylized, there was color out of space, which I caught at TIFF, and I personally have issues with it, but I know a lot of people who've really enjoyed it. Cage made me uncomfortable before anything weird even started happening. He's having a nice little romantic moment with his wife, and I just felt oh my God, what is he? I just felt grossed out before it even got to a point where I should have been feeling grossed out. If you're into body horror, I think this really delivers, and if you're into Nicolas Cage acting like a crazy person, it's probably the movie for you. And now you've seen her take on vampires, werewolves, and aliens. Now watch K-Stu take on Cthulhu. But yeah, if you're into giant monsters and you're into something that's kind of like The Abyss meets Alien Light, Underwater is likely going to be worth checking out. By no means is this a perfect movie, but I think it accomplished what it set out to pretty well, and if you're a fan of the genre, you'll probably have a really good time. Stewart actually does an incredible job expressing the anxiety and fear, how it never settles the entire time all this stuff is happening to her, which is super realistic because if it was me, I probably would have offed myself the second I realized the access to the upper levels was shut down and we were going to actually have to leave the compound safety and there was potentially things going on outside. And one last one that I'm actually really interested to see, but I haven't had a chance to yet, and it's called After Midnight, which I've also been hearing really good things about. And I think there was one more that I didn't see called Inmate Zero, so I can't say anything about that. But now it's officially time to get into the, it's January movies on this list. So as mentioned, the one that started this all off was The Grudge, which is a sidequel to the Grudge series. This means it's not really a reboot, it's not a full prequel, and it's not a full continuation. It doesn't get an extra number at the end, and it's just named as if it's the first installment, even though it deals heavily with things in previous installments. Sidequel. A lot of people got really excited about this when they realized the director was the guy who made The Eyes of My Mother and that it was being produced by Sam Raimi. But we should all know by now that somebody being in the production seat doesn't really mean anything. Now, this is one of these movies that kind of upsets me because there was a lot of potential, but it just wasn't good. Pesci's got good visuals, great actors, but my God, that does not come together well at all. And what a waste of this cast. And like I mentioned, I think there was a lot of really good potential here. I don't know how much of it came down to a studio versus directing choices, but I know in a lot of these situations, studios' insistence that audiences are dumb and need to have things kind of spoon-fed to them a little bit too much oftentimes gets in the way of telling a good, riveting, interesting story. And I think this is definitely the case here because the international ending is different than the North American ending, which we'll get to. But I get that not everybody wants to watch something like The Vivitch, but you gotta have at least a little bit of faith in your audiences that they can follow along. Now, one of the things this movie is doing is that they have like a running counter on the screen that lets you know what year which characters are a part of. But I, like my friend Art over at LME, think that it would have been awesome to completely omit that. It would have led to a lot more suspense in certain areas, and I think there could have been a really cool way to have this playing off simultaneously for a bit until you realize, oh my god, they're on different timelines. That alone would have immediately made this movie so much better, but that's not what happens, and it's a big disappointment. So this movie also suffers from just way too many storylines. It's got like 5 different movie ideas that they could do. Instead of picking like a couple, they went with all 5, which means that any of the interesting storylines don't ever get fully actualized because they have to jump between all these different characters. It's also not scary, and I don't even mean like it was all cheap jump scares. I mean the jump scares they had weren't scary. They don't even work, which I think is actually really common for like all of the movies that I'm talking about in this section, but there's also a bunch of callbacks of moments and scenes and shots that were in the other movies, and they're just used for the sake of making people pull that DiCaprio like, oh, look, oh, I recognize that from a previous installment. But how about you just like make your own really cool scenes? Like, you've got some really nice visuals in this. Why didn't you either use those callbacks in a way that had meaning or just come up with something sick for yourself? And like I mentioned, the international version had a significantly better ending that kind of leaves you, if you were paying attention, you're like, oh my god, they're moving in there? Oh my god. And then it's just left up to you, the viewer, to imagine what happens, rather than getting the comical ending that America gets that made people laugh or groan. Then we get the turning, which at this point, I'm gonna make an entire video about because there's just so much going on here when nothing at all is actually happening. So this movie is actually based off a very famous novella by Henry James that was made all the way back in 1898 called The Turn of the Screw. So for those of you wondering why this was called The Turning and there's nobody like turning into anything, that's why. And when it comes to the story, there's a lot of debate as to what's actually going on. Is the governess insane? Are there actually ghosts possessing the children? Are there ghosts just around messing with people in general? And depending on your interpretation, it actually changes the story quite a bit. And the movie makes the bold choice not to, I don't know, maybe pick a side that the director feels is more accurate or leave things ambiguous in a way that, you know, people can debate about. They just go ahead and film like 3 different endings. And unlike Portrait of a Lady on Fire, all of these endings suck. And at first I was kind of interested because this thing hit me as a period piece when it starts with the TV talking about the death of Kurt Cobain. Yes, the 90s are officially a period now because we're all old. But instead of this movie having some classic grunge hits, it's all music from now. And I'm not saying that the music is bad, it's good, but what is the point of making this a period piece if you're not even going to attempt to have the character listening to music from that timeline? Literally, the closest they get is getting Courtney Love to write a song for the movie. You couldn't even get a whole song? It's also loaded with all of our favorite cliche. We got creepy dolls, creepy mannequins whose head moves randomly when no one's around, a bathtub scene, ghosts in windows, all the standards. We get like 2 or 3 scenes where it pulls through the character's eyes. It actually starts with one of those, which, are they trying to say that maybe none of this happened? Is it all like a premonition for the future? Is it all just happening in her head? Is it all fake? Who knows? And I'm sure they don't either. Gretel and Hansel. Ooh, do you see what they did there? They flipped it up. It's not Hansel and Gretel. Oh, that's tight. So yeah, this is a movie that looked stunning. It was shot so incredibly well, but it was just so void of deeper substance that I am upset that the color palette and the cinematography just looked so beautiful. It wasn't like dynamic and movement. There were definitely issues there, and it just was not great. We've got vanishing accents from Sophia Lillis. At one point, it feels like a music video from some Evanescence Queens of the Stone Age fusion band, and it's burdened with monologue voiceovers that I'm positive had to have been added down the line. Basically, what I'm saying is we should all just rewatch I'm Not Okay With This because I'm not okay with this. Fantasy Island, our horror reboot of a classic TV series and one of my favorite of the bads because it was at least fun and has Lucy Hale in it. I have a full video of this on my channel, so feel free to check that out. And finally, Brahms, The Boy 2. Now, The Boy 1 was actually not bad, had some nice moments, had some nice subversion going on. I think it's worth the watch. But this one, I just like to call Katie Holmes What are you doing? And now we're coming right back around to a super dull horror movie, which seems to be the trend of these bigger studio releases this year for whatever reason when it came to the horror ones. Like, I'll at least give points to Fantasy Island for being entertaining to some capacity at times and how ridiculous it got. This was just boring. The creepy doll isn't even creepy, and all dolls are creepy. So how do you even manage that? Though I will say, glorious ending. Learn the rules, kids. Every year has its stinkers. This one really outdid itself. We had bad sequels, bad reimaginings, tired execution, lazy screenwriting, and just wasting some truly incredible actors in bad movies. And if you liked any of the movies that I shit on, don't take it personally. Everybody likes different things. There's tons of bad movies that I like. I was just pointing out that this was a very strong year for some dull horror, and a lot of these had the potential to be so much more if they had just tried a little bit harder. But that's gonna do it for today's video. Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comment section down below. Please subscribe if you are new and into that kind of thing, getting close to 100,000 subscribers. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Let me know what some of your favorite all-time horror movies are. What are some things you're watching right now? Let me know down below. So once again, thank you all so much for watching. Have a fantastic day, and we'll catch you all later.